We've got back-to-back sprint races coming up in F1 Fantasy, so it's probably time to start thinking about some chips. Let's check it out. What is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Backup Fantasy Sports. It is Friday, April 12th. My name is Ewan. On today's episode, we're going to get into some F1 fantasy with a early chip strategy preview. Like I said, we've got back-to-back sprint races coming up in China and Miami on the race calendar. So it could be a good time to get to know the chips and when we are going to start playing them. I've actually already used one of my chips this year, the no negative in Australia, saved me a minus 20. But we're going to go through a chip strategy explanation, what each chip is. And then at the end of the episode, I'll go through some possible chip strategies for the next 2 or 3 races. So check those out in the timestamps below. And while you're down there, just like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Would be greatly appreciated for the support. So here are the 6 chips: Limitless, Wildcard, Autopilot, Final Fix, Extra DRS, and No Negative. Like I said, I've already used the No Negative, but plenty of you guys have not used that yet. So this will cover all of that for the remainder of the season. As you can see, top 35K in the world right now. I've got 3 transfers going into China. So there's definitely lots of different strategies going around the F1 fantasy community. And it's going to make for a fun time, some divergence, I would say, amongst those of us on X for F1 fantasy. So let's get into the explanations here. Extra DRS and Final Fix are up first. So extra DRS, the driver will score 3 times the amount of points that they accrue on the weekend, but you will also have your regular DRS boost to put on another driver. So this worked really well for most of us in 2023 in Austria, where we used the extra DRS boost on Max, and we put the regular DRS boost on Sergio. I think some of us were scoring like 450 points that weekend. It's a little bit more difficult this year because of the pricing and how it's highly unlikely a lot of us can get to double Red Bull with some form of constructor that we would like to kind of round out the weekend. However, if you were maybe going to roll with like a Red Bull, Haas, Sergio, Checo kind of lineup, extra DRS could come in handy over a sprint weekend if you were feeling it there. Final Fix is probably the most strategic kind of reactive chip that we've got in the game. So you play this chip after any session prior to the Grand Prix to replace one driver in your lineup with another. They have to cost less, or you have to have the budget for them to come into your side. So with whatever that driver costs plus your cost cap, you can replace that driver with after any session. And by any session, I mean after a sprint race, you can change the driver out and you will get the qualifying and the Grand Prix points. If you change them out after qualifying, you will only get the Grand Prix points, and you will keep the sprint points and the qualifying points for your original driver. You will also keep the price gains from the original driver as well. So I think a lot of us tried to use that. I didn't do the strategy, but last year, while we were trying to gain budget in the game, a lot of people put Lando in for a sprint weekend, and then they final fixed him out after the sprint or after qualifying for Max Verstappen. So you kept the gains of Lando Norris, but then you got the points for Max Verstappen for the sprint race and for the Grand Prix. I think it worked out quite well. It was a pretty unique strategy. So definitely something to think about there. Usually a final fix is kind of handy if you have Max in your team and say, or you have Checo in your team and Checo qualifies second, but Charles Leclerc qualifies 19th. Like Ferrari just have a disaster. You could definitely final fix Sergio out for Charles and get all of Charles's Sunday points. So the thing that makes it a little bit more different this season is that the way that the sprint format is for each weekend is it's now FP1 and then sprint qualifying, which we found out on last week's episode that is not going to be the lock for China anymore. So we're not going to have to lock our teams in until the actual sprint race. So we will have more data, kind of like how the cars are running and like race trim. We'll get the F1 the F1.com practice debrief article with all the data in there to kind of help us out with our decisions. We'll get sims from F1 Fantasy Tools and 11ify probably. So it'll definitely be a much more help for our lineups with all that extra data from the sprint qualifying, hopefully. So yeah, it's practice, sprint qualifying, sprint race, then the Grand Prix qualifying, and then the Grand Prix is still on Sunday. So a little bit of a tweak. It's pretty interesting for F1 Fantasy though, as last year qualifying was on the Friday and we had to lock in our lineups after one FP1 session. So it was a lot of guessing. No negative does what it says on the tin, really. Any driver who scores negative points in any session of the weekend will have their score reset to 0. It has had a slight tweak from last year where it was if the driver total for the weekend was less than 0, it just got reset to 0. But now it's for any session. So if a driver crashes out in, like, if they do not classify, if they don't set a time in the qualifying or whatever, they would get a -5. That would just reset to 0, but then they could still gain points in the Grand Prix or the sprint. That way you wouldn't have to make up all the points. So it's just for any session. So pretty easy chip there. Saving that for wet races, high DNF tracks, that sort of thing. Wild card is if your F1 team is just not really doing it for you and you don't have the amount of transfers you need to kind of reset for the upcoming week. It will not reset for the following race week. So when you wildcard, that team will be the one that you have for the next few races until you make any transfers to kind of change that up from there. But it's not like the limitless chip that will reset your lineup after 1 week. This is a little bit of a conundrum for me right now with the wild card is I just rolled one transfer from Japan into China. So I have 3 transfers for China now, which is nice. I don't need to activate the wild card, but there's also part of me that might be playing the limitless chip in China now. So I wish I'd maybe been more aggressive in Japan because with the limitless chip, you will just have 2 transfers coming out of that week. I will not have, I will not have that third transfer coming out into Miami if that's what you thought. If you play Fantasy Premier League, it's kind of like the free hit chip, where even if you have 2 transfers going into using your free hit, you just have 1 coming out on the other side. So that's how you should really think about the limitless chip. But we'll get to that in the next slide. Wildcard, just kind of reset your whole team. Don't take any penalties for the -10, -20. Wildcard was a little limited in its like strategic use last year in the game because it was only -4 for a transfer to like take a hit and get an extra guy in. But this year, with the -10 penalty, the wild card could and should be a little bit more powerful for our lineups. Autopilot here is just, it automatically places a DRS boost on the highest scoring driver in your lineup. So this would have been pretty handy for those of you last weekend that were chasing budget with Aston Martin. You probably had to downgrade Red Bull or Ferrari to an Aston Martin, but then you could have boosted your second driver up to, like, if you had Sergio, you could have boosted him up with Leclerc or Sainz and hopefully kind of gained more budget that way in your lineup. And if you activate the autopilot, it would have put the DRS boost on the highest scoring driver out of Checo, Charles, and Carlos. So that was quite handy. I think I did that in my third team, and I think Sergio still ended up with it, but it was pretty close there for a while. And Limitless and the extra DRS chip, I would say, are the 2 most powerful chips in the game. So you really want to nail this one. So for 1 week, you can choose a driver lineup without a cost cap. Just whatever you want, get all the strongest assets in the game. Your lineup will reset to what you had before playing the limitless chip for the following race week. So right now, my team that I had in Japan was Checo, Lance, Valtteri, Yuki Tsunoda, and Alexander Albon with Red Bull and Ferrari as my constructors. If I play the limitless chip in China and I get triple Red Bull, triple Ferrari, and a McLaren, just say, or an Aston Martin or whatever, the team that I have for Miami, which is the following race, will be the same team that I had in Japan. So just I think that's been quite a popular question going around, like in the comments below, on F1 Fantasy Tools Discord, on F1 fantasy Reddit. Yeah, so that's how it's going to work. So if you play the limitless chip, it's just like a free hit chip in fantasy Premier League again, kind of. And then your squad goes back to what it was before, but you will gain the budgets from your original Japan team, not from the limitless team. So just keep that in mind as well. But that's an explanation on all six of the chips. So when should we play the chips? That is kind of the next most popular question in F1 fantasy these days. So limitless chip, I would play in a sprint when there's firm, like dominant top two teams. That's why China is going to be so popular for limitless. I know it's kind of nice to save your chips for late in the season when you can make a big boost, but with the limitless chip, right now Ferrari and Red Bull are so far ahead that you can feel really confident that those two teams will, like, both their drivers will probably finish in the top 5. Max will probably win, Sergio will get a podium, and then Check or Charles or Carlos will be the other podium car, and the other one will probably finish top 5 no matter what. So that's why it's kind of nice to play that now when you can feel pretty confident about what the outcome of a race is going to be. Whereas later in the season, there's going to be teams might be developing their car for next year, upgrades might be coming, it might shake up the order of the grid, that kind of stuff. So limitless chip, while we know what we know kind of stuff, and getting the most popular 6 assets in your team. The thing about limitless in China is McLaren is likely to struggle, I would say, just based on kind of the layout of the track. So the fifth option there is where we could get different. Uh, George Russell would probably be the guy I put in there right now. Maybe Fernando Alonso as well. But yeah, to be determined there. Extra DRS is a good first sprint weekend as well with a dominant team. I don't think we're going to get as lucky as we did last year where we could do it with Max and Sergio. I don't think that's going to be an option unless you wait until the end of the year and we really, really build up our budget. I can't imagine we're ever going to get up to that kind of heights in our budget where we can run Max, Sergio, and Red Bull all in the same race, but we'll see. It could happen. I can't imagine that we would get that much budget. No negative would be a good high DNF track or a wet race. A lot of people say like Monaco is probably a good one for that. But yeah, that's going to be kind of a like a week by week basis. You don't really have to save that for a sprint race, I would say, anymore, especially with like the sessions kind of just uh, week by week. You wouldn't have to worry about having a negative score over a whole weekend. Final fix would be if a popular driver qualifies badly. Kind of went over that. Like if you have Checo in your lineup and Charles qualifies badly, swap out Checo for Charles. You get all his Sunday points. Wild card would be to avoid taking a -10, -20, which I know some people might want to do for China this week. So that's why wild card could be an option for them to get Max in. And autopilot is honestly if like Red Bull struggles in free practice and it's not looking great, like a Singapore. You could have used that last year in Singapore. Like if you had Max and say you had Carlos in your team and you're kind of expecting Red Bull to turn it on Sunday, but you put the DRS boost on Max, activate the autopilot chip. You have Carlos Sainz or Lando Norris. Yeah, you probably had Max and Lando. You would have gotten Lando as your DRS boost guy and gained a lot more points than Max, who was struggling through the field. So that's kind of when you want to save autopilot. Honestly, if Red Bull struggles in free practice, activate the autopilot, put it on Max, and whatever or Sergio and whatever your second driver is will hopefully outscore them and gain you some points on the field. The 2024 sprint race schedule. So as you saw, we do want to play most of our chips during a sprint weekend, or that's when you can maximize your points. So when are the sprint races this year? So we've got China and Miami, the next 2 races coming up over the next 3-ish weeks. We've got Spielberg, the Red Bull Ring in Austria in June. Then we kind of wait a pretty long time and they cram them all in at the end. Austin, Brazil, and Qatar. That's when you can make huge gains in the game. However, Brazil could be a wet race. Qatar is hot. I think the tires were melting in Qatar last year. I think that's where Oscar Piastri won his sprint, if I am not mistaken. But yeah, so these are the 6 sprint races for the 2024 F1 calendar. As you can see, we've got 3 in the first half, 3 in the second half, kinda after the summer break. Yeah, I won't be using a chip in Austin. I'm still scarred from the Coda incident where I know a lot of us did this, used the limitless chip on Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc to get into our side, and they got DQ'd. Absolutely brutal. Still not over it. But this is when you should try to time out your extra DRS boost and your limitless chip for the 2024 season. I can see a lot of people using their limitless chip over the next 2 races in China and Miami as Red Bull and Ferrari stick atop the standings. There is word that I'll try to look into it more for the preview episode next week for the Chinese Grand Prix, but upgrades are starting to come, like big upgrades for a lot of the teams. So we'll definitely need to keep that in mind because if McLaren or Mercedes are bringing upgrades to like Imola, and that could shake up the grid by Spielberg or by the Red Bull Ring in Austria. We will probably want to kind of avoid that and use one of those chips in China or Miami. Arms race here is just kind of pointing out how big of an advantage you can get in the sprint. So I've got the 4 highest scoring drivers with their sprint average in the game from last season. So that was Verstappen, Norris, Sergio Perez, and George Russell compared to their 2023 overall average. So in the 2023 sprint races, Verstappen scored 53.5 points compared to 46.1 points over every race weekend. Norris saw a huge jump in the sprint average. He was at 31.3 points compared to 19.9 in his regular race. Sergio, 30.8 compared to 26.3. And George Russell, 25 points per sprint race compared to 17.5. So it is really important to kind of nail these sprint races. As you can see, like, okay, maybe 7 points doesn't look a lot, but over 6 races with a DRS boost, that's a ton of points that Verstappen is going to score over the field every week. And even if it is kind of just boring Max Verstappen just getting like 10 points, just kind of clean sweeping the weekend and getting like not having a ton of overtake points, it's still going to be so many points for your F1 fantasy team. So that's why Max is a high priority for the Chinese Grand Prix, whether it's via limitless, via free transfers, whatever you're going to do. I really, really strongly urge you to try and figure out a way to get Max Verstappen in your F1 fantasy lineup. So how are we going to kind of do that? So I've got 3 chip strategies here kind of for the next 3-ish weeks or 3 races to kind of go over. So possible chip strategy 1 here is in China, you would play your limitless chip. And then in Miami, you would wild card. And then in Imola, you would not use a chip there. So this would keep your team from Japan and you would jump on the dominant Red Bull and Ferrari assets as they are right now. And then you can reset in Miami, hopefully with more budget. Maybe you can get away from some of the like bottom of the barrel back markers and just have a little bit more room to play with. Hopefully some results go your way. You can build some budget that way. And then you'll just have a kind of a clean reset. This will enable you to bring in Max possibly for Miami, even if you have like a bad budget, if things don't go well in China, if you have the wild card, you can really finagle whatever you need to do to get him in your team for Miami. So this means this would also guarantee that you have Max in your lineup for both sprint races and moving forward. If you use the wild card, you'll have 2 free transfers in Imola for to kind of if you want to get away from Max, start building budget again. But this strategy will mean that you definitely have Max Verstappen in your lineup for the Chinese Grand Prix and the Miami Grand Prix. Possible chip strategy number 2 here is China, where you don't use a chip. Now, this is most likely for people in my similar position. I know a lot of us have 3 free transfers. So this would be if you can bring in Max for free to the Chinese Grand Prix. That way So the only way I can do it is I will have zero point 0.0 in the bank, and I would have Max Verstappen with Alex Albon, Logan Sargent, Joe Guan Yu, Valtteri Bottas, and then Ferrari and Red Bull. So no Ferrari drivers, the 4 lowest scoring assets in the game, along with Max Verstappen, is incredibly risky. I don't enjoy that one bit. However, getting him in for free, saving the limitless chip could be nice. I'll probably take a red arrow that week if people are activating the limitless chip left and right. However, China, unknown track at this point, has been 5 seasons. The last time F1 was there was 2019. We've not seen this track been raced around with the new set of regulations. So that is something to think about as well. How much data are we going to get from FP1 and the sprint qualifying? So it could be a little bit of an unknown. It may not how do teams set up for the track. So if you can get there for free, it could be worth it to save the limitless chip. Whereas Miami, this will be the third time we're going to Miami. The first time it's going to be a sprint race, I believe. But their teams are more well set up for that track. I think Max has come back from like 8th or ninth each year to kind of win that race or finish second. So it could be a strong track for Max. And then after Miami, you would have so you would use your limitless chip in Miami. You'd have that team that you have in China, which I have, which is not ideal. I'm jealous of the people that can get up to like a Hulkenberg as like their second driver at least. And then I would wild card out of that limitless chip, hopefully after having some budget gains, to get a Checo and a Lance Stroll back into my team for Imola for regular races and kind of build budget again from there. Although, now that I'm saying it out loud, I mean, we'll have some upgrades by Imola as well. But with the wild card, there is a possibility that Sergio could be out of the B tier by then. Actually, I can look that up real quick. If you give me 1 second here, he is currently sitting at, of course, the F1 website has locked me out here. Let's see, my team. So Sergio's at 22.7 million right now. So if he goes up a million each of the next 2 races, which is as much as he possibly can, he'll be 24.7 million. So you'll still get Sergio in for Imola and get a big price gain from that last race if you use the wild card there. Final chip strategy here is if you wild card in China. So this would be if you don't have 3 free transfers, or you can't get Max in for anything less than like a -10 or even a -20, I think it's worth it to activate the wild card to get him in, avoiding hits to bring in Max. Then you can limitless chip, use the limitless chip in Miami, like I just like we did in the previous strategy, and then also just no chip. So you would wild card in, and then that team would gain budget in Miami. You'd have 2 free transfers for Imola, but you'd build more budget in Miami. Obviously, after you use your wild card, you're probably relying on 4 back markers, but you are avoiding hits. This is probably my least favorite strategy out of the 3 that we've talked about so far. And I'm not totally sold. If you're on a -10 and you want to save the wild card, I don't hate it if it's to bring in Max. If you're trying to do something different that costs like a -10, I would probably just use the wild card, save your points there. But if you can get Max for a -10, I don't hate it. It just depends on if you think you're going to have to reset your team with more transfers later down the road. And also if you have Max for China and then you limitless in Miami, you are kind of locking in a point 2 price gain, and you're losing points on the field as well. So definitely something to think about there. And you're likely relying on 4 back markers as well, very similar to chip strategy 1 or chip strategy 2 right here. So I think if I was gonna kind of rank these, I would say chip strategy 1 is my favorite, chip strategy 2, and then chip strategy 3. That would kind of just 1, 2, 3. That's how I would rank them. But Let me know in the comments below how many transfers you have, what your chip strategy is, what you like and you don't like about the 3 chip strategies that I put forward there. If you have any questions about the chips, just let me know in the comments below as well. Yeah, second video this week, just because it seemed like a good time to put out the chip video. I know F1 Fantasy Hub did a chip video already this week, so that was great job by them. And Rain Fantasy as well has also done a chip video. So go check those out after you check this one out and like and subscribe to the channel. There will be a race preview out Monday, Tuesday, I would say, for the Chinese Grand Prix in my neck of the woods. And I will no deadline live stream for the Chinese Grand Prix, as I will be taking a weekend trip to Stockholm, Sweden. But I think on Thursday night, I'll probably put out just like a final thoughts video if we get any word on upgrades, kind of looking at media day, what people were saying around the track. So definitely a race preview next week and possibly a quick kind of like final thoughts, final preview before the weekend. But yeah, once again, thanks for watching the video. Hopefully that puts some ideas in your head. Let me know in the comments below, like I said, what your chip strategy is. How many chips have you used? Any chips yet? What are your conundrums for China? And I will just answer them over the course of the weekend. But once again, thanks for watching and thanks for listening. And I will talk to you next time.